Thank you, and good afternoon. I am Isabella Bird. It has been some decades since I have appeared in public. You'll forgive me. I was a fragile child, and my parents were urged to give me as much fresh air and exercise as possible by the local doctor, who suggested my father take me up in front of him as he rode about on parish business. And so I spent my early years on a cushion, propped before him on his saddle, and I learned to ride as I learned to walk. Those rides also taught me my powers of observation. For Father would question me constantly on everything we saw, calling my attention to the fields far and near, in grass, in crops or fallow, to the farmhouses, their dairies and press houses, telling the uses of all and each. It was this ill health which led to surgery to remove fibrous tumors from my spine when I was 18, and which had entire teams of doctors advising me to travel for my health. I felt as though my life were spent in the very ignoble occupation of taking care of myself, and that unless some disturbing influences arose, I was in great danger of becoming perfectly encrusted with selfishness. So I took my first journey with my father's blessings and permission to remain abroad until my funds of 100 pounds should carry me no further. That proved to be my first journey through North America, from Newfoundland on the Atlantic shores of Canada, down through the colonies to Boston and back. I wrote long, detailed letters, all I observed, to my sweet sister, Henrietta, at home in Scotland. And these became the basis for my first travel novel, The English Woman in America. I found that the proceeds from this book, along with the writing I did for religious periodicals, allowed me to pursue my charitable work in a more efficient fashion. All my philanthropic work was based on minute calculations of its likelihood to secure from those benefited an honorable and self-respecting contribution to its maintenance. What modern charity lacks is intelligent financing. Despite the many hours of travel and writing required for this work, my health failed again. I was bedridden. On the advice of my physician, Dr. Murray Mitchell, and that of Henrietta's new doctor, John Bishop, trained by the great Joseph Lister himself, I once again embarked upon a journey. At age 40, this time to Australia, the Sandwich Islands, and the Rocky Mountains of North America, leaving in July of 1872. I was under orders to shift the scene as much as possible and to remain within the curative influences of sea and mountain air. For the first weeks on board ship, I was dull and dejected, uncomfortable. But when the line was crossed and the weather grew cool with favoring winds, I began to bring my work on deck. Then I caught a chill and was so prostrated the captain thought I was dying. There were so many disagreeables below decks to add to my suffering. Loud quarrels, noisy complaints, a dirty stewardess, and above all, vile conversation. I landed in Melbourne in October, where I spent 2 months resting, visiting the bush, noting its gum, acacias, bottlebrush, and blackwood trees. I left for New Zealand November 28th. upon a small crowded steamer, its decks loaded with sheep and horses, and worst of all, a lunatic in the berth next to mine. There, I visited both the Otago and Canterbury settlements. Heat and dust prevailed, and I was appalled at the drunkenness everywhere. I left for my next destination, the Sandwich Islands, specifically the island of Hawaii, on New Year's Day of 1873. And despite an unseaworthy vessel and dangers that threatened at several stages, which you can read about in my book, The Hawaiian Archipelago, I found myself this time delighting in the sea. I wrote to my friend Mrs. Blackie, "At last, I am in love. And the old sea god has so stolen my heart and penetrated my soul that I seriously feel that hereafter, though I must be elsewhere in body, I shall be with him in spirit. I have imbibed the very spirit of the sea. It is to me like living in a new world, so free, so fresh, so vital, so careless, so unfettered, so full of interest that one begrudges being asleep. Instead of carrying cares and worries and thoughts of the morrow to bed with one to keep awake, one falls asleep at once, to wake to another day in which one knows there is nothing to annoy one. No doorbells, no policemen's, no dirt, no bills, no demands of any kind. No vain attempts to overtake all one knows one should do. It sounds a hideously selfish life, but in the inevitably intimate association of people in all circumstances, for months of almost entire isolation, human relations spring up, and human interests, and in some cases, warm feelings of regard, which have a tendency to keep selfishness, to a degree, under. During the voyage, I undertook to help with the nursing of a young man who fell seriously ill, and whose mother opportuned me to disembark in Honolulu and stay with them. I was 6 months in the Hawaiian archipelago, longer than I had intended to remain, and where I had some of my more notable raptures, including being the first white woman to climb to the summit, the volcanic summit of Mount Kilauea. The precipices and gulches we crossed in that country, by horse or mule, forced me to learn to ride astride and abandon the side saddle for most of my stay. Leaving the raptures of Hawaii behind, I embarked for San Francisco, and there, by rail, and later by horseback, I traveled to the frontier territory of Colorado. My adventures there were, as always, documented in long letters to Henrietta, which later became one of my most popular travelogues, A Lady's Life in the Rocky Mountains. It appeared in October of 1889. A second edition was called for in November, and the third appeared in January. And this after being published as a serial in the leisure hour. For the details of my friendship with Mountain Jim, and my time in Estes Park, or my famous ascent of Long's Peak, I must refer you to this text, for our time today does not allow its inclusion. Rather, I wish to speak of my 600-mile solitary ride through the territory. To that end, I and my friend and guide, Mr. Evans, left Estes Park and headed on the trail to Longmont. It was a most glorious ride. We passed through gates of rock, through gorges where the unsunned snow lay deep under the lemon-colored aspens, caught glimpses of far-off snow-clad giants rising into a sky of deep, sad blue. Evans went ahead into Denver, and after I settled into the inn, where, after some days, he brought back much news. The letter and newspaper fever had seized on everyone. The financial panic had spread out west, gathering strength on its way. The Denver banks had all suspended business. They refused to cash their own checks or to allow their customers to draw $1, and would not even give greenbacks for my good English gold. Business was suspended, and everybody, however rich, was for the time being poor. The Indians had taken to the war path and were burning ranches and killing cattle. There was a regular scare among the settlers, and wagon loads of fugitives arriving in Colorado Springs. The Indians said, "The white man has killed the buffalo and left them to rot on the plains. We will be revenged." Uprising or not, my ride could not begin until I acquired some basic necessities. "My kingdom for a horse," I cried to Evans. He had not got me one, and a shadow crossed his face when I spoke of the subject. Eventually, he asked me for a private conference, and he told me with some confusion that he had found himself very hard up in Denver and had been obliged to appropriate my $100 note. He said he would give me, as interest for the money, a good horse, saddle, and bridle for my proposed journey. I was somewhat dismayed, but there was no other course, as the money was gone. In justice to Evans, I must mention here that every cent was ultimately repaid, that the arrangement turned out a most advantageous one for me, for the horse was perfection. I now had a bay Indian pony, Birdie, a little beauty, with legs of iron, fast, enduring, gentle, and wise, and with luggage for some weeks, including a black silk dress tied behind my saddle. I was tolerably independent. I wrote to Henny, "My letters on this tour will, I fear, be very dull, for after riding all day, looking after my pony, getting supper, hearing about the various routes, and the pastoral, mining, and hunting gossip of the neighborhood, I am so sleepy and wholesomely tired that I can hardly write." I left the Longmont Inn pretty early on Tuesday morning. The evening before, I had been introduced to a man who had been a colonel in the rebel army, who had made a most unfavorable impression upon me, and it was a great annoyance to me when he presented himself on horseback to guide me over the most intricate parts of the journey. Solitude is infinitely preferable to uncongeniality and is bliss when compared with repulsiveness. So I was thoroughly glad when I got rid of my escort and set out upon the prairie alone. It was a dreary ride of 30 miles over the low brown hills into Denver. My sailing orders were steer south and keep to the best beaten track. At the top of every prairie roll, I expected to see Denver. But it was not until nearly 5 that I looked down from a considerable height upon the great city of the plains. There the great braggart city lay spread out, brown and treeless, upon the brown and treeless plain, which seemed to nourish nothing but wormwood and the Spanish bayonet. The shallow Platte shriveled into a narrow stream with a shingly bed 6 times too large for it, and fringed by shriveled cottonwoods, wound along by Denver. 2 miles up its course, I saw a great sandstorm, which in a few minutes covered the city and blotted it out with a dense brown cloud. I had to trust entirely to Bertie's sagacity for finding Evan's shanty. She had been there only once before, but carried me direct to it over rough ground and trenches. There I was received most hospitably by Mrs. Evans and the children, and made warm and comfortable, though the house consists only of a kitchen and 2 bed closets. On Thursday, October 23rd, I wrote to Henny, Mr. Evans has provided me with an excellent horse and saddle, and I have a new bloomer suit with a bear jacket over it. Denver has composite streets with good stores, but being the outpost of civilization, they present a singular aspect. Here are rig stores with every article for the plains, and camping out saddle stores where nothing is sold but huge Mexican saddles. Indian stores and no end of fur stores and fur depots. Crowds solely masculine. I only saw 5 women the whole day. Men in every rig, hunters and trappers in buckskin suits, men of the plains in huge blue cloaks with belts and revolvers, teamsters in leather suits, horsemen in fur coats and caps and buffalo hide boots with the hair outside, camping blankets behind their huge saddles. Broadway dandies in light kid gloves, rich English tourists, clean and comely, and heaps of horse Indians on their small ponies, their buckskin dresses sewn all over with beads, red blankets wound round them, faces painted vermilion with long straight hair, and squaws riding astride with furs over their saddles, all picturesque and wild. I had been introduced to former Territorial Governor Alexander Hunt, a most jovial, genial spirit, who most kindly traced a route for my journey and marked the settlers' cabins where I might bespeak bed and board, and gave me a circular letter of introduction. I traveled south from Denver along the canyon country towards Colorado Springs, and got off and took off my skirt a mile from Denver, being in very bad pain, and you cannot imagine the unspeakable relief of getting on astride. Governor Hunt's route first took me to Van Warmer's, the host being a most repellent man, but his wife, a very agreeable, ladylike sort, said she could give me a bed upon the sofa. It was the most pretentious house I had yet seen, being papered and carpeted with 2 hired girls. There was a lady there, a Mrs. Hutton from Laramie, remarkable as being the first white woman who had settled in the Rocky Mountains. She had been trying the camp cure for 3 months, and had a wagon with beds, a floor tent, a cooking stove, and every camp luxury, with a buggy and a man to manage it all, and a most superior hired girl. I soon found there was a screw loose in that house of the repellent host, and was glad to leave early the next morning, although it was obvious there was a storm coming on. I saddled Birdie and rode 4 miles, crossing a frozen creek, the ice of which broke and let the pony through. I cannot describe my feelings on this ride, produced by the utter loneliness, the silence and dumbness of all things, the snow falling quietly without wind, the obliterated mountains, the darkness, the intense cold, and the unusual and appalling aspect of nature. There was not a footmark nor a wheel mark. There was nothing to be afraid of, and although I can't exactly say that I enjoyed the ride, yet there was a pleasant feeling of gaining health every hour. I was well clad, except for my feet, and kept myself warm and had an excellent horse. But still, it was eerie. I saw the cars of the Rio Grande Railroad whirl past, all cushioned and warm, and rather wished to be on it, and not about among the snow on the bleak hillside. And still, the snow fell softly, and the air and earth were silent. I resolved to put up at Barker's, a ranch which had been recommended to me. It was very tolerable. The cold became awesome. All the stock came round the house with mute appeals for shelter. Sheepdogs got in. Men went out muffled and came back shivering and shaking the snow from their feet. I had no sheets, and the cold in the night was so awesome that I pulled the rag carpet from the floor to put over my bed. On Saturday, I left the Barkers at 8:30. More snow had fallen, the frost was intense, the sun brilliant, the snow sparkling like diamonds. After an hour's ride, the horse could hardly keep on her feet because of balls of ice 4 inches high in her shoes. I met a boy who told me I could get a chisel at a house nearby, and there they received me very warmly, and I had hot coffee and 2 tumblers of cream. They were a most pleasant people, Welsh, from Glamorganshire. I started again and rode 12 miles. It was getting very awful. I turned off from the road and went 2 miles into the hills by an untrodden path with many gates to open, forded a steep-sided creek, and at the entrance to a fantastic gorge, came upon an elegant frame house, to which I had an introduction, belonging to Mr. Perry, son of a millionaire banker in St. Louis. He was away, but his sister, a very elegantly dressed girl, came and asked me in to dinner. There were all the refinements of a table and a black table maid and various luxuries. After dinner, a male cousin rode with me into the park. It is very grand and beautiful, with singular monumental rocks from 50 to 400 feet high. They are bright vermilion, green, buff, orange, and sometimes all combined. Their gay tinting a contrast to the snow and somber pines. When we got back, Miss Perry pressed me to remain. She has been traveling with her father in Europe for 3 years and gone to Egypt, Palestine, Asia Minor, Turkey, and Moscow, and was most intelligent in her descriptions of it. It was so odd and novel to have a beautiful bedroom, hot water, and other luxuries. The snow began to fall in good earnest at 6 in the evening, and by morning there were 8 inches of it glittering in the sun. Miss Perry gave me a pair of her brother's woolen socks to draw on over my boots, and I set out tolerably early and broke my own way for 2 miles. The sky was absolutely cloudless, and I made the long ascent of the Arkansas Divide. The mountains, gashed by deep canyons, came sweeping down to the valley on my right, and on my left, the foothills were crowned with colored, fantastic rocks like castles. Everything was buried under a glittering shroud of snow. The babble of the streams was bound by fetters of ice. No branches creaked in the still air. No birds sang, no one near or far. The only sound was the crunch of snow under Bertie's feet. We came to a river over which some logs were laid with some young trees across them. Bertie put one foot on this, then drew it back, put another on, then smelled the bridge noisily. Persuasions were useless. She only smelt, snorted, held back, and turned her cunning head and looked at me. It was useless to argue the point. And we forded the river there, though it was deep enough to come up to her body. Afterwards, I heard that bridge was dangerous. Bertie was the queen of ponies and was very gentle, though she has not only wild horse blood, but is herself the wild horse. She was always cheerful and hungry, never tired, looked intelligently at everything, and her legs were like rocks. Just as the sun sank behind a snowy peak, I reached the top of the divide. There, in unspeakable solitude, lay a frozen lake. Owls hooted amongst the pines. The trail was obscure, the mercury at 9 below zero. My feet had lost all sensation, and one of them was frozen to the wooden stirrup. The eastern sky was like anything I ever saw before. It had been chrysoprase, then it turned to aquamarine, and that to a bright, full green of an emerald. Unless I am colorblind, this is true. Then suddenly the whole changed and flushed with the pure, bright rose color of the afterglow. I was nearly paralyzed with the cold when I reached a cabin that had been recommended, but there were 17 snowbound men lying on the floor, and they advised me to ride a half-mile further, where I found refuge in the loft of a German family. The next morning was gray and sour. After riding 12 miles, I got bread and milk for myself and feed for Bertie at a large house with 8 boarders, each one looking nearer the grave than the last, and was directed to diverge through Monument Park. I came to strange gorges with wonderful upright rocks of all sizes and shapes, and turning through a gate of rock, came upon what I knew must be Glen Erie, as wild and romantic a glen as imagination ever pictured. The track then passed down a valley, close under some ghastly peaks. Wild, cold, awe-inspiring scenery. After fording a creek several times, I came upon a decayed-looking cluster of houses bearing the arrogant name of Colorado City. And 2 miles further on, from the top of one of the ridges, I saw the bleak-looking scattered houses of the ambitious watering hole of Colorado Springs, the goal of my journey so far of 150 miles. I got off Bertie, put on my long skirt, and rode sideways, though the settlement scarcely looked a place where any deference to prejudices was necessary. A queer embryo-looking place it is, out on the bare plains, Yet it is rising and likely to rise, and has some big hotels much resorted to. It has a fine view of the mountains, especially of Pikes Peak. But the celebrated springs are at Manitou, 3 miles off, in the really fine scenery. To me, no place could be more unattractive than Colorado Springs from its utter treelessness. I stayed that night at Liller's and could not sleep for the cold, and all night heard groaning and sobbing. The landlady said to me afterwards, "It turns the house upside down when they come and just die. We were half the night laying him out." So many come in the last stages of consumption, thinking that Colorado will cure them, without even money to pay for the coarsest board. I dispatched a 12-page letter to Henny, dated October 29th of 1873. Place, the Great Gorge of the Manitou, Rocky Mountains. Therein, I described it to her as a fearful place. A rushing torrent in a valley and mountains covered with snow rising on 3 sides and overhanging to a height of nearly 15,000 feet. It is grand and awful and has a strange, solemn beauty like the beauty of death. And locked in these snowy horrors a mile from here is the Ute Pass, by which, if all be well tomorrow, I shall traverse the heart of for the mountains. Later, I was to rewrite that description from my letter to one which my readers no doubt found more comforting, adding, "This is a highly picturesque place, with several springs still and effervescing, the virtues of which were well known to the Indians. It has 2 or 3 immense hotels and a few houses picturesquely situated. It is thronged by thousands of people in the summer who come to drink the waters, try the camp cure, and make mountain excursions." We called at General Palmer's to say I could not stay there, and were entertained at that baronial mansion, a perfect eyrie. The fine hall filled with buffalo, elk, and deer heads, skins of wild animals, stuffed birds, bear robes, and numerous Indian and other weapons and trophies. Then, through a gate of huge red rocks, we passed into a valley called, fantastically, Garden of the Gods, in which, were I divinity, I certainly would not choose to dwell. Many places in this neighborhood are also vulgarized by grotesque names. There I stayed to have a last taste of luxury at the Grand Hotel, which during the season boasts 400 fashionable guests, but was now half price and held 15, most of whom were speaking in the weak, rapid accent of consumption, and are coughing their hearts out. There were huge fires and 6 blankets on the bed. It was to be the 3rd night in Colorado I had slept on anything better than hay or straw. When I left the Great Manitou, there was not a cloud on the bright blue sky the whole day. And though it froze hard in the shade, it was summer heat in the sun. The mineral fountains were sparkling in their basins and sending up their full perennial jets. But the snow-clad, pine-skirted mountains frowned and darkened over Ute Pass as I entered it to ascend. A narrow pass it is, with barely room for the torrent and the wagon road, which has been blasted out of its steep sides. All the time I was in sight of Fountain River, brighter than any stream, because it tumbles over rose-red granite, rocky and disintegrated. A truly fair stream, cutting and forcing its way through hard rocks, under arches of alabaster ice, through fringes of crystalline ice, thumping with a hollow sound in cavernous recesses cold and dark, or leaping in foam from heights with rush and swish, always bright and riotous, never pausing in still pools to rest, dashing through gates of rock, pine-hung, pine-bridged, pine-buried, twinkling and laughing in the sunshine or frowning in the blue pine gloom. And there, for a mile or two in a sheltered spot, the everlasting northern pine met the trees of other climates. There were dwarf oaks, willows, hazel, and spruce. The white cedar and the trailing juniper jostled each other for a precarious foothold. The majestic redwood tree of the Pacific met the exquisite balsam pine of the Atlantic slopes, and among them all, the pale gold foliage of the large aspen trembled, as the legend goes, in endless remorse. Up ever, the road, being blasted out of the red rock which often overhung it, the canyon, only from 14 to 20 feet wide, the thunder of the fountain, which is crossed 8 times, nearly deafening. It was all snow and ice, and we could hardly keep on our feet, and we had to cross several creeks on ice which broke through. I saw a beautiful white fox, a skunk, some chipmunks, squirrels, owls, crows, and crested blue jays. I dislike forest alone because it is so dark, and one never knows what may appear from behind the trees. That forest is full of bears and pumas. At last, when the sun was slanting, I got through the woods and the pass opened out onto a sunlit upland park. It is a fair mountain park, all buff, sun-dried hay, with a stream fringing with the everlasting cottonwood, and from low ranges the pines sweep down in clumps, leaving fair glades of grass where one looks for mansions. The south end is completely closed up at a distance by the huge bulk of Pikes Peak, snow-clothed and pine-fringed, while beyond the other end are peaks and towers, wonderful in blue and violet color, and beyond these, sharply defined against the clean green sky, the mere glistening peaks of a snowy range 200 miles away. It was truly fair, but not lovable, and was freezing hard. This park, called Bergens, was bought by a Dr. Bell of London, but whose present occupant was Mr. Thornton, an English gentleman. He was building a good house and proposed to build other cabins with the intention of making the park a resort for strangers. The cabin was long, low, mud-roofed, very dark. The middle place was full of raw meat, fowls, and gear. One end, almost dark, contained the cooking stove. 10 hired hands sat down to the meal with us. It was all very rough, dark, and comfortless, but Mr. Thornton, who was not only a gentleman by birth, but an M.A. of Cambridge, seemed to like it. 7 large dogs, 3 of them with cats upon their backs, were usually warming themselves at the fire. I did not leave Mr. Thornton's until 10 the next morning because of the slipperiness. I rode 4 miles along a back trail and then was so tired I stayed for 2 hours at a ranch, where I heard to my dismay that I must ride 24 miles further before I could find any place to sleep at. After starting again, I came upon a hideous place of which I had not heard before, Hayden's Divide. One of the great backbones of the region, a weary expanse of deep snow 11 miles across and fearfully lonely. I saw nothing the whole way but a mule lately dead lying in the snow. I was very nervous somehow, and towards evening believed that I had lost the road, for I came upon wild forests with huge masses of rock from 100 to 700 feet high, cast here and there among them. Beyond these pine-sprinkled hills, these in their turn were bounded by interminable ranges, ghastly in the lurid evening light. It seemed awful to be alone on that ghastly ridge, surrounded by interminable mountains in the deep snow, knowing that a party of 30 had been lost here a month ago. Just at nightfall, the descent of a steep hill took me out of the forest and upon a clean log cabin where, finding that the proper halting place was still 2 miles further on, I remained at Twin Rock. A truly pleasing, superior-looking woman placed me in a rocking chair, would not let me help her otherwise than rocking the cradle, and made me feel at home. The room, though it serves them and their 2 children for kitchen, parlor, and bedroom, is the pattern of brightness, cleanliness, and comfort. At supper there were canned raspberries, rolls, butter, tea, venison, and fried rabbit. And at 7, I went to bed in a carpeted log room with a thick feather bed on a mattress, sheets, ruffled pillow slips, and a pile of warm white blankets. I slept for 11 hours. They discourage me much about the route Governor Hunt has projected for me along Tarryall Creek. They think it is impassable owing to snow and that another storm is brewing. I had a short day's ride to Colonel Kittredge's cabin on Oil Creek, all through parks and gorges, with Pikes Peak always in sight, and spent a Saturday amongst agreeable people. The Kittredge's cabin is very small and lonely, and it seems a hard grind for an educated and refined woman. I rode the 12 miles back to Twin Rock and then went on, a kindly teamster who was going my way taking my pack. I must explain that every mile I have traveled since Colorado Springs has taken me farther and higher into the mountains. That afternoon, I rode through lawn-like upland parks with the great snow mass of Pikes Peak behind, and in front, mountains bathed in rich atmospheric coloring of blue and violet, all very fine but threatening to become monotonous when the wagon road turned abruptly left and crossed a broad, swift mountain river, the Platte. Excuse me. There, I found the ranch to which I had been recommended, the quarters of a great hunter named Link, which much resembled a good country inn. We had a splendid, though rude, supper. In the evening, Mr. Link returned, and there was a most vehement discussion between him, an old hunter, a miner, and a teamster, as to which route by which I should ride for the next 3 or 4 days, because at that point I was to leave the wagon road. A violent argument erupted where, if my nerves were not of steel, I should have been appalled. The old hunter said he must speak the truth. The miner was directing me over a track where for 25 miles there was not a house, and where if snow came on, I should never be heard from again. The miner said he must speak the truth. The hunter was directing me over a pass where there were 5 feet of snow and no trail. The teamster said that the only road possible for a horse was the wagon road into South Park, which I was determined not to take. Mr. Link said he was the oldest huntler and settler in the district, and he could cross any of the trails in snow. And so they went on. At least they partially agreed on a route. The worst road in the Rocky Mountains, the old hunter said, with 2 feet of snow upon it. But a hunter had hauled an elk over part of it. That ride concentrated all my faculties on finding the way. The trail, for the most part, kept in sight of Tarryall Creek and was walled in on both sides by high mountains. I rode up one great ascent where the hills were tumbled about confusedly, and suddenly across the broad ravine, rising above the sunny grass and the deep green pines, rose in glowing and shaded red against the glittering blue heaven a magnificent and unearthly range of mountains, rising into colossal points cleft by deep blue ravines, with gigantic knobs and pinnacles rising from their inaccessible sides, a glowing, unforgettable sight. They were more brilliant than those incredible colors in which painters array the fiery hills of the desert. Below them lay broken ravines of fantastic rocks, cleft and canyoned by the river, with a tender, unearthly light over all. I rode up and down hills laboriously in snowdrifts, getting off often to ease my faithful birdie by walking down ice-clad slopes, stopping constantly to feast my eyes, always seeing some new ravine with its depths of color or a miraculous brilliancy of red or fantasy of form. I crossed a lake on the ice and then came upon a park surrounded by barren, contoured hills, overtopped by snow mountains. Excuse me. There we crossed a deepish stream on the ice, which gave way, and the fearful cold of the water stiffened my limbs for the rest of the ride. The trail was very difficult to recover. It ascended ever in frost and snow. There were no sounds to be heard but the crackle of ice and snow, the pitiful howling of wolves, and the hoot of owls. I was cold, for my boots and stockings had frozen on my feet, and I was hungry too, having eaten nothing but raisins for 14 hours. After riding some way, I saw a light a little way from the track, and found it to be the cabin of the daughter-in-law of the pleasant people with whom I had spent the previous night. Mrs. Link was an educated and very intelligent young woman. Her husband had gone to the plains, yet she, with 2 infant children, was living there in perfect security. 2 peddlers came in for a night's shelter soon after I arrived, ill-looking fellows enough. They admired Birdie in a suspicious fashion, offering to swap their pack horse for her. The peddlers were Irish Yankees, and the manner in which they traded was as amusing as Sam Slick. They not only wanted to swap my pony, but trade my watch. I went out the last thing at night and the first thing in the morning to see that the pony was safe, for they were very importunate on the subject of the swap. I was obliged to sleep with the mother and children. The peddlers occupied a room within ours. It was airless and hot. There was another dispute about my route. The peddlers insisted I could not get through. But Mrs. Link thought I could and advised me to try. So I saddled Birdie and rode off. How I found my way, I shall never know. For the only marks on the snow were the occasional footprints of a man, and I had no way of knowing if they led in the direction I ought to take. I passed the last great haunt of the magnificent mountain bison, but unfortunately saw nothing but horns and bones. The snow grew seriously deep. Birdie fell 30 times, I am sure. She seemed unable to keep up at all, so I was obliged to get off and stumble along in her footmarks. The getting through the snow was awful work, and once we went down in a drift, the surface of which was like ripples like sea sand, Birdie up to her back and I up to my shoulders. At last we got through and beheld, with some sadness, the Great Divide, and between it and me, South Park. A rolling prairie, 75 miles long and over 10,000 feet high, treeless, bounded by mountains, and so rich in sun-cured hay that one might fancy all the herds of Colorado could find pasture there. A great many people came up there in the summer. The rarefied air produces great compression on the lungs, accompanied by bleeding. It is said you can tell a new arrival by seeing him go about holding a bloody handkerchief to his mouth. When I struck the Denver stage road, I supposed that all the difficulties of mountain travel were at an end, but this did not turn out to be exactly the case. A horseman joined me shortly and rode with me for 10 miles. He was a picturesque figure. He wore a big slouch hat, from under which a number of fair curls hung nearly to his waist. His beard was fair, his eyes blue. There was nothing sinister in his expression, and his manner was frank and respectful. He was dressed in hunter's buckskin, ornamented with beads, and wore a pair of exceptionally big brass spurs. Beside a rifle laid across his highly ornamented saddle, and a pair of pistols in the holsters, he carried 2 revolvers, and a knife in his belt, and a carbine slung behind him. He told me a great deal about the country and its wild animals, and a great deal about Indians and their cruelty and treachery. I found him what is termed good company. We stopped at a cabin where the woman seemed to know my companion, and in addition to bread and milk, produced venison steaks. She said, "I am sure you found Comanche Bill a real gentleman." And I then knew that if she had given correct information, my intelligent, courteous companion was one of the most notorious desperados in the Rocky Mountains, and the greatest Indian exterminator on the frontier. A man whose father and family fell in a massacre at Spirit Lake by the hands of Indians, who carried off his sister, a child of 11. His life since then has mainly been devoted to a search for this child and to killing Indians wherever he can find them. I remounted Birdie to ride 6 miles further. The road ascended to a height of 11,000 feet, and from thence I looked my last at the lonely uplifted prairie sea. Denver stage road, the worst, rudest, dismalest, darkest road I have yet traveled on. Nothing but a winding ravine, the Platte Canyon, pine crowded and pine darkened. Along this abyss for 50 miles, there were said to be only 5 houses. And were it not for the miners and freight wagons, the solitude would be awful. As it was, I did not see a creature. The snow, which had melted in the sun, had become one sheet of solid ice. Birdie slipped so alarmingly, I got off and walked. She seemed so likely to fall on me. I took out of my pack the pair of men's socks which had been given me at Perry Park, and drew them on over her forefeet, an expedient which for a time succeeded admirably. At last, when the socks were nearly worn out, I saw the blaze of a campfire and found that this was the place I had been told to put up. A man came out in the good-natured stage of intoxication, and the door being opened, I was confronted by a rough bar. This was the worst place I put up at, as to food, lodging, and general character. An old and very dirty log cabin, unchinked, with one dingy room used for cooking and feeding, in which a miner was lying very ill of the fever. They asked if I was the English lady written of in the Denver newspaper, and for once I was glad that my fame preceded me, for it seemed to secure me against being quietly put out of the way. A horrible meal was served, dirty, greasy, disgusting. The landlord, having passed into the sodden, sleepy stage of drunkenness, his wife asked if I should be afraid to sleep in the large, canvas-sided, unceilinged, doorless shed. So there I slept on a shakedown, with the stars twinkling overhead and the mercury showing 30 degrees of frost. I once gave an unwary promise that I would not travel alone in Colorado unarmed. I had a Sharps revolver loaded with ball cartridge in my pocket, which had been the plague of my life. Its bright, ominous barrel peeped out in quiet Denver shops. Children pulled it out to play with it, or when my riding dress hung up with it in the pocket, pulled the hole from the peg to the floor. And I could not conceive of a circumstance in which I could feel it right to make any use of it, or in which it could do me any possible good. That night, however, I took it out, cleaned and oiled it, and laid it under my pillow, resolving to keep awake all night. I slept as soon as I lay down, and never woke till the bright morning sun shone through the roof, making me ridicule my own fears and abjure pistols forever. Next night I spent in a beautiful place, like a Dutch farm, large, warm, bright, and clean, with an abundance of clean food. But it was very hard to write, for 2 free-tongued, noisy Irish women who keep a miners' boarding house in South Park were telling the most fearful stories of violence, vigilance committees, lynch law, and stringing that I ever heard. It turns one's blood cold to think that where I traveled in perfect security, only a short time ago, men were being shot like skunks. At the mining towns up above this, nobody is thought anything of who has not killed a man in a certain set. At Alma and Fair Play vigilance committees have been lately formed, And when men act outrageously and make themselves generally obnoxious, they receive a letter with a drawing of a tree, a man hanging from it, and a coffin below on which is written, "Forewarned." When I said I had spent last night at Hall's Gulch, there was quite a chorus of exclamations. My host there, they all said, would be strung before long. Did I not know that a man was strung there yesterday? Had I not seen him hanging? He was on the big tree by the house, they said. Certainly, had I known what a ghastly burden that tree bore, I would have encountered the ice and gloom of the gulch rather than have slept there. This man had shocked even the morals of the Alma crowd, and had a notice served upon him by vigilantes, which had the desired effect, and he had migrated to Hall's Gulch. As the tale runs, the Hall's Gulch miners were resolved either not to have a groggery or to limit the number of such places. And when this ruffian set one up, he was forewarned. It seems, however, to have been merely a pretext for getting rid of him, for it was hardly a crime of which even lynch law could take cognizance. He was overpowered by numbers and, with circumstances of great horror, was tried and strung on that tree within an hour. Public opinion approved this execution, regarding it as fitting retribution for a series of crimes. I rode to Denver down Turkey Creek Canyon, which contains some magnificent scenery. The road ascends and hangs on a ledge of a precipice some 600 feet of depth. Such a narrow road that on meeting a wagon, I had to dismount. From thence, there was a wonderful view through the rolling foothills and over the gray-brown plain to Denver. Not a tree or shrub was to be seen. Everything was rioting in summer heat and drought. While behind, the last grand canyon of the mountains, dark with pines and cool with snow. I followed the creek down to the plains and then devised a way for myself over the prairie. While the head chiefs of the Ute and Arapaho are in Washington and an attempt is being made to reconcile them, these two tribes have met on the plains with great slaughter. I came by a circuitous route to avoid the sight of the corpses which, scalped, stripped, and hideous, had lain there unburied for 2 days. They are a most difficult problem, treacherous and savage as enemies, and when subdued, apparently equally impossible and uncivilizable. The Americans will never solve the Indian problem until the Indian is extinct. A mile from Denver, I got off Birdie, put on a skirt, and rode sideways. I thank you for your attention today.